It's my pleasure to speak to this audience today. I'm what my good friend Jamie Pennebaker has referred to as the ambulance chaser of disasters. But perhaps a better summary of what I study was once offered by my former dean, who introduced me on my campus as follows. There are two careers that everyone is happy that other people are doing. One is a proctologist, and the other is what Roxane Silver does for a living. I'm actually a traditionally trained social psychologist who studies major traumatic life events that in general share a number of characteristics. They are random, they are unpredictable, they are uncontrollable, and when they are a community-based event, they're like a natural disaster, a school shooting, a terrorist attack, they are a shared experience among many victims. Now, I'm often asked, how in the world did I start studying these kinds of things as a traditionally trained social psychologist? But actually, there's a very long history in social psychology about the desire for and value of control over important outcomes and reinforcements. And back in the 70s, I became interested in the psychological consequences of the loss of control, especially when this loss of control occurred suddenly and without any warning. Our early research, most conducted with Camille Wortman years ago, was actually conducted in the laboratory with college students, often seeking experimental credit in psychology courses. So what did we do? The early lab research on uncontrollable outcomes involved staging accidents. For example, we created the opportunity for subjects to knock over a box of key-punched computer cards. Some of you in this audience may never have seen a key-punched computer card, but if you look in the lower corner, that's actually what many of those who are older in this room used to do. We used to sit and key-punch computer cards, and then we would keep these computer cards in a very strict order in boxes. And we created a situation where when in the laboratory, we sort of created a domino effect where a subject came in and through an inadvertent activity by them, they knocked over a box of computer cards that had a big sign on it saying, so-and-so's dissertation, please do not move. So we created this staged accident, one way in which we started to look at how people reacted to loss of control. We also did things like give people unexpected shock. Sometimes I carried in a portable shock generator into a lab room. It looked sort of like this, but it actually had electrodes on it, and I administered shock to unsuspecting subjects. Sometimes we used what was very popular back in the 80s, the early 80s, insoluble anagrams, where we frustrated our subjects with a series of anagrams in which they were told to solve within a particular time frame, in which, like here, this light was flashing, but they had no solution. And sometimes we used uncontrollable noise bursts, where we put headphones on people and we gave them 80 decibels of sound. These were the kind of things that people were not able to control, and they just came without warning. Now, I did all of the above in the attempt to learn how people responded to uncontrollable and unpredictable experiences. But this early research was really very unsatisfying. First of all, we were always confronting with the question of whether what we were doing to our subjects was ethical. And in order to make it ethical, we ended up studying very trivial stressors compared to real-life uncontrollable outcomes. And we were always struck with whether or not what we were doing was studying events that were relevant to the real world, to the events that we were really hoping to generalize to. So for example, in a psychology experiment, subjects are entering the room and they're doing so by their own choice. They're choosing to be in the studies. They may not know what they were in for, but they were nonetheless choosing to do these things, which is quite different from what happens in the uncontrollable outcomes in the real world to which we hope to generalize. And also, it did not seem to engage the same psychological processes that we were hoping to study. It just seemed to me that the laboratory stressors were quite unlike events like an airplane falling out of the sky into one's house, which happens. I collect all of these, not too infrequently, or the result of a devastating firestorm that completely burns down a community, maybe leaves one house standing somehow randomly. Or these kind of experiences seemed very different than what you would see in a community, how people responded after a hurricane or a tornado. And so I, a few decades ago, transitioned from the laboratory to the field. And my earliest program of research was on how people acutely responded to traumatic life events. My early work actually was quite slow, and I studied personal traumas, like my first study, which was how individuals coped with a spinal cord injury, where we interviewed 125 people, several points in time, starting within a week after being injured that resulted in, for many, in permanent paralysis. But it took 3 years to collect our first wave of data. My second study was done on loss of an infant to sudden infant death syndrome, in which I followed 124 mothers from 3 weeks after their baby suddenly died without warning over 18 months. But it took 2 years to collect wave 1 data, despite the fact that I was doing this in both Cook County, Chicago, and Wayne County, Detroit, Michigan. Also, I have to admit that I felt terrible waiting for people to become paralyzed or waiting for babies to die. And so I started to think ultimately that maybe it would be better to study these processes in collective traumas, where many people were exposed to a trauma, like in a single event, like the Columbine High School shootings or the Southern California firestorms. These studies involved having a large team of trained interviewers descend upon the community, and in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy, go up to people and try to interview them. I'll note that our Columbine High School study, high school shooting study, we trained 15 interviewers who sadly only got 11 interviews. In my study of the Southern California firestorms, we were more successful, but we had to train 20 interviewers to collect data on 85 people in 1 day, 36 hours after they returned home from a forced evacuation from one's community. So I'll just take a few minutes to tell you about the study that we did of the Southern California firestorms in the 90s. Again, this was a massive, massive effort for an N of 85. In these studies, we measured the immediate, we measured exposure and the immediate psychological response. And we learned several things, for example, like sometimes positive affect was more frequent than negative affect shortly after a disaster for both individuals who lost their home and didn't. And we studied this 36 hours after people returned home when their community had been shut down. And we also saw that when we followed these people over time, we continued to see these effects. So we continued to see that positive affect was more frequent than negative affect, even amongst individuals who lost their home, as well as for individuals who did not lose their home. Now, while these studies were more informative than my laboratory work, I was still extremely frustrated, and I was frustrated by several things. The first was the inefficiency in this data collection effort. Enormous training of interviewers, enormous challenges in getting through the IRB quickly, and yet it would take years sometimes to collect the first wave of data. And also, and this is something that bothered me most of all, I was studying non-representative samples of individuals, and so any conclusions that I would be drawing might be a result of the particular individuals who my interviewers approached or the particular people who agreed to participate in my study. Ultimately, and fortuitously, I began working about a dozen years ago with a survey research firm that some of you may have heard of called Knowledge Networks. And Knowledge Networks, it's now called GFK, was really a godsend to me, because this group of individuals who were very, very successful survey researchers created a large national panel of individuals who were recruited via traditional epidemiological survey methodology, For those of you who know a little bit about epidemiology, there are a couple of different ways of bringing people into a sample. One is through what's called random digit dialing. That's not used as much anymore because people's telephone numbers no longer indicate where they live. And now what people do is what's called address-based sampling. But knowledge networks use these traditional techniques to create a sample of individuals who were representative of the US population. And they also had samples available to me that were representative of particular regions. Panelists complete surveys in exchange for internet access and an appliance to conduct to the internet. In the early years, they used web TV, then they gave people laptops, and now since many people have their own laptops and have their own internet connections, they offer points for people to complete these surveys in which they can exchange for merchandise. What was particularly important for me is that panelists complete profile surveys in advance of my being able to study a traumatic event. So they collect data on demographics or mental and physical health histories, lifestyle and behavioral assessments are done on everybody when they enter the panel. And then I can collect information from these individuals already having those pieces of data collected by somebody else. Importantly, anonymity is maintained. Some of you might be in my studies. I don't know who's in my panel, in my particular studies, because the panel anonymity is maintained relative to the people who do the research on them, which really helps with IRB approval. And also for me, I believe that I'm getting much more valid data because people are not sitting face to face with an interviewer and they are able to report information that they might not want to share publicly or with somebody else in the room. In addition, and very importantly for me, immediate post-event data collection is possible. And because they maintain the identity of their participants, even though I don't know, we can collect longitudinal data over time. And so my first project with knowledge networks was a 7-wave study that was conducted for 3 years after the 9/11 2001 terrorist attacks. And in 14 days, I could collect data on literally thousands of individuals. Working with knowledge networks, I could actually study the immediate response to the 9/11 attacks, because on 9/11/01, the night of the September 11th attacks, an email was sent to 36,000 Knowledge Networks panel members. About 20,000 people opened the email, about 14,000 people responded to a single open-ended prompt which said, if you would like, please share your thoughts of the shocking events of today. Now, these were anonymous posts. No one knew whether anybody was going to read them or not, and in fact, pretty much nobody did read these posts. But I was very interested in who actually responded to express their thoughts and feelings. There's a lot written in the clinical literature about whether or not emoting or expressing one's thoughts and feelings after a disaster or after a tragedy might be psychologically beneficial. And in fact, what we found was that we sort of, in looking at who actually responded, we saw that older individuals who had more physical health problems before 9/11 and who had more traumatic life events were more likely to respond to this prompt and also wrote longer responses. We also interestingly found that those who chose to respond to the prompt and who wrote longer responses actually had worse doctor-diagnosed physical and mental health problems over the next 2 years, suggesting that the cathartic release did not seem to show any long-term psychological benefits. I could also examine regional responses to the 9/11 attacks by looking at representative samples from communities across the United States. So in this particular slide, I'm showing you the percentage of individuals who were reporting high rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms in 2 months in the first 6 months after 9/11. And I just want you to take a look at the second line, New York City and Miami. And in fact, we found that people in Miami were reporting very similar rates to New York, and we have all sorts of reasons why we expect that to be the case. Nonetheless, never before could I collect data regionally this quickly and compare regional responses, but I had the ability to do so in this particular project. We can also see that acute responses to the attack, when combined with an ongoing fear of terrorism, actually led to increased risk of developing heart problems 2 and 3 years after 9/11. That is, among those individuals who responded to the 9/11 attacks with high acute stress, which is who I'm graphing on this slide, and this is people who are responding with a lot of distress in the first week or two after 9/11, those who continue to worry about terrorism, that's the yellow bars, actually had almost 5 times increased risk of being diagnosed with a new onset heart problem over the next 2 years, and over a 3 times increased risk of being diagnosed with a new heart problem over the next 3 years. We also found that early television exposure was a very important predictor of psychological responses in both the immediate and the long term. So we found that watching more than 4 hours a day of television about the 9/11 attacks in the first week after the attacks, and these data were actually collected a week after the attacks, predicted acute stress responses. That is an immediate reaction of acute stress, but it also predicted increased post-traumatic stress symptomatology over time, over the next 2 years. We also saw this physical health increases in physical health problems over the next 2 years and over the next 3 years, linking immediate television exposure and the degree to which people were watching a lot of television after the 9/11 attacks over the next 3 years. In fact, these results strongly suggested to us that constant media exposure to graphic images of the psychological impact of takes the psychological impact of a collective trauma and disperses it very widely. And we become very interested in the impact in which media is transmitting distress after a traumatic event. Of course, a lot's changed in the decade since 9/11, and in the media landscape is very, very different. There was really only television after September 11th, but the media landscape, as we've just heard, has been very different and changing in recent years, and that led to the impetus for my most recent study of the April 15th, 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. And again, I partnered with Knowledge Networks. In this most recent study, we actually were able to collect data from a representative sample of almost 900 individuals from Boston, about 1,000 individuals from New York City. I was really interested and am very interested in repeated exposure to trauma, and to about 3,000 individuals from across the United States. And importantly, I could collect data on about 5,000 people in 14 days. Very different from my efforts that I did years ago. Now, while many of us were probably not in Boston at the time, we nonetheless learned about the bombings and subsequent search for the perpetrators in many different ways. So some of us learned about this by watching television. Many of us read online news sites or watched streaming videos. Maybe many people got their news about this from Facebook or YouTube or posts to Reddit, many of which offer unfiltered and sometimes graphic images of horror. Or Twitter. Twitter really came of age in terms of its ability to help find the perpetrators, and Twitter was a place that both individuals and law enforcement used to inform people in both words and pictures about what was going on in the immediate aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing. And we found that the number of acute stress symptoms reported in the weeks after the marathon steadily increased with additional hours of marathon-related media exposure. And what I'm doing here is I'm combining the number of hours in which people are being exposed to media reports of the Boston Marathon bombing and its aftermath in both traditional media, television, radio, and print, and social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Also, these findings persisted, controlling for pre-marathon mental health and pre-bombing media habits, which fortunately we had because these data were collected on the sample in advance of my study. This graph compares the degree of association between different types of exposure to the bombing and acute stress responses in this sample of about 4,600 people. And we found that repeated exposure to bombing-related media of all types was associated with higher acute stress than was direct exposure to the bombing, actually having been in the marathon, been in Boston during the lockdown, or having a loved one who was in the same place. In fact, the effect size of greater than 6 hours of media exposure is about 3 times that of direct exposure. I should mention that the average number of hours to which people were exposed to media about the Boston Marathon bombing was about 4 hours. That's not meaning that people are spending 4 hours sitting in front of their television, but throughout the day they might be checking Facebook or Twitter or television, listen to the radio, checking YouTube, on and on. And on average, people were spending about 4 hours a day in this, engaging in media in this fashion. So 6 hours a day is above average, but it's certainly not abnormal. We also were very interested in figuring out what are the longer-term implications of this, and we've just completed our 6-month follow-up of the sample. And what I was interested in particular was the role of media exposure on fears of terrorism over time. So to what extent was this early exposure to the Boston Marathon and its aftermath associated with 6 months later fears of future terrorism? And what we found, in fact, that media exposure, both television exposure and non-traditional media sources like Facebook, Twitter, or other sources of exposure online, as well as seeing bloody pictures, was associated with fears of future terrorism 6 months later. And it was far more likely to be associated with fears of future terrorism than having been directly at the marathon. In fact, the effect size for direct exposure was 1/5 that of television and 1/6 that of having been repeatedly exposed to bloody pictures of the bombings. Our newest data strongly suggests that exposure to graphic pictures through whatever mechanism may have some negative psychological consequences for feelings, thoughts, and perhaps health over time. And because many of the images and videos on social media are not monitored or filtered by anyone, and people end up seeing them without warning, we are essentially now studying uncontrollable outcomes via media exposure. We plan to follow our sample for the next several years to see the long-term effects of this media exposure. So collecting data in the early aftermath of a disaster has been very useful for me, and it's taken me far from subjecting people to noise bursts or electric shocks, which is what I did 30 years ago. But I have to admit that I'm really not satisfied yet, and my planned projects will use technology to start even earlier, before the uncontrollable event even happens. And briefly, I have 2 new projects planned that I'll just share with you quickly. The first one is working with storm chasers, the storm chasers on the Discovery television show. We're working with the storm chasers, wind engineers, meteorologists, and an interdisciplinary team of social psychologists and decision scientists. And our goal is to go into a community as people start to go out because a hurricane is coming. We'll be offering tablets to individuals about 48 hours before the approaching hurricane, in which we can collect data pre, during, and post-storm. The second project will use a smartphone app to collect geocoded data from individuals residing in at-risk communities. Again, being able to collect data pre-storm, during, and then following people over time, because until this point now, nobody has been able to link anything prior to a storm coming and thoughts and feelings before a storm comes with how people actually respond over time. Maybe Jamie will invite me back in a few years and I'll be able to present some of these data. Stay tuned. And I'd like to thank my collaborators.